Thank you, Mark. It's good to be with you all. Before I forget, as Mark mentioned, I'm serving right now as the executive director of the Camino School, and I left a prayer card on your table, so be sure to take one of those. There's a Prayer to the Holy Spirit by St. Jose Maria Escriva on the back, which if you haven't seen already, I think this crowd would like a lot. Yeah, it is kind of neat. I was actually thinking about that myself as I prepared this talk. This subject is sort of my geeky obsession. I don't think enough people first realize and then appreciate the unparalleled marvel. I mean, that might sound a bit over the top. It's really not. Of the Catholic school system in the United States. We built on the backs of poor immigrants, largely, under a time of intense persecution. We built the single largest private school system ever in the history of the world. So I want to take you through how we got to the high point in 1965. I'm not really going to talk about where we've gone since then. That's another talk for another day. But I think we'll see, because of the unparalleled marvel that we created here in the United States, the impact that it had on this nation over the course of those decades and centuries. So where I want to begin is to contextualize why the impact is so important and was so, why it had such an impact on our nation. I want to start with what the Founding Fathers had to say about the importance of religion and morality when they founded our country, which unfortunately a lot of people forget as well. You also have a handout where I want you to hear a lot from, you're going to hear mostly from the bishops of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'm going to lean heavily on them. I want you to hear from them more than from me. So we're going to go through how they influenced the growth of Catholic schools over those two critical centuries. But like I said, first let's remind ourselves what the Founding Fathers had to say about religion and morality. George Washington said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens." John Adams said it a little more succinctly. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So what I want to show is Catholic education, by nature of its very definition, and we'll look at how the bishops over time defined Catholic education, directly supports that idea that in order to be good citizens, we need to be a strong religious and moral people. This is from a history on Catholic schools in the United States, and I think it's just a good snapshot of what happened here in the United States. So this is sort of a thesis statement of what we'll talk about this morning. It says, "Meanwhile, the Catholic Church sought to secure to her children and through them to our growing republic the inestimable blessing of a religio-moral education. Spanish and French missionaries made humble beginnings, but to the clergy of the English colonies may be attributed the 17th century cradling of the Catholic school system in America. During 2 centuries, the growth of Catholic schools was due largely to the vision and zeal of individual pastors." I'm going to repeat that sentence. During 2 centuries, the growth of Catholic schools was due largely to the vision and zeal of individual pastors. That's one of the things I want to highlight. It's easy to, especially once we get to 1965 and see those big numbers, like 5.5 million students enrolled in Catholic schools, it's easy to think of it as this big system and forget that we got to 5.5 million largely due to the vision and zeal of individual pastors in individual churches, in individual parishes, in individual communities. The Third Baltimore Council made their establishment, as far as it might be prudently possible, imperative. That is the establishment of Catholic schools. And their growth since then has been the astounding marvel in the religious history of America. So, to highlight the earliest roots, as Mark sort of made mention to, as did that quote, the Spanish friars were the first to bring any semblance of Catholic education to the United States in Florida and New Mexico. In 1565, they found St. Augustine, Florida, and 1598, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was just a normal part of the missionary activity that they would create a school in connection with the church and begin teaching not only the tenets of the faith, but also a basic liberal arts curriculum of some sort. We fast forward to 1727, and the Ursuline nuns are the first ones to establish an actual school that sustains itself over time as a school and not just a function of missionary activity. And actually that school is still in existence today, Ursuline Academy in New Orleans. One of the striking features at the time, which obviously comes out of our Catholic faith, it makes sense to us, but to a lot of outsiders it was striking that those schools were for rich and poor alike, and including as far back as 1727, both African and Native Americans. This was the emphasis of the schools. Religious instruction was always regarded as the most important part of the school's work. It included prayers, daily examination of conscience, preparation for the sacraments, and daily study of the catechism. It was chiefly for this purpose that the school existed, and the principal lesson for the girl, in this case, to learn was to know and love and serve God in order by this means to become one day blessed. So religious instruction was always regarded as most important. But what about the parish schools that we know today? Those really trace their roots back to the colonial times. The settled town life in the eastern colonies was much different, obviously, than education on the frontier. So these schools are really the template for what we know today as Catholic elementary and secondary schools. And about that same time as these colonial schools were emerging, in 1723, the first public schools were introduced into a number of the colonies. This is also important to note because it is the introduction of the public schools that we'll see kind of drives the imperative from the Catholic bishop's perspective and pastor's perspective of the need for Catholic schools, and we'll get into why in just a moment. Again, the outstanding characteristic of Catholic colonial schools was their religious purpose. In this, they were not unlike the contemporary schools of other denominations. Religion supplied the motive force for education. Instruction was to be given not only in the usual elementary subjects, but also and primarily in religion. It was about passing on the faith. Certainly the basics of regular education as well, which at that time would be a traditional liberal arts education. But the purpose for the Catholic school was the passing on of the faith. There was no question about that. So the mother school of all the parochial schools in the colonial times was St. Mary's Church in Philadelphia. Philadelphia at the time was the largest city in the colonies, and St. Mary's was the largest and wealthiest parish. A couple interesting things to note, though. The progress of the church, its biggest city, it's the biggest parish. However, the historians note that the success of that school and the progress of it was due in large measure to the personality and influence of the two priests that were in charge. It was the pastors that drove the school. Tuition was charged to most of the pupils, but it was decided in 1783 that each of the teachers was to instruct 6 pupils for free every year. Again, we start getting into the mission of Catholic education, to pass on the faith to all students, not just to be a private school. It was even hoped at that time to have a sufficient endowment for the school to eliminate tuition charges entirely. And eventually the revenue for the school was obtained through church collections and gifts from individuals. Through church collections, not parent collections. It's important to note. Okay? It was seen as a function of the parish, the whole parish, not just for the parishioners who had kids. This was a function of the Catholic parish. The pastor saw it that way, and everyone in the congregation saw it that way. Now, Mark mentioned Bishop Carroll. In 1792, Bishop Carroll issued a pastoral letter making known the regulations of the First National Synod. So it was the first time that any bishops in America gathered as a single body. And what was their opening theme? But education. And they emphasized the necessity of a pious and Catholic education of the young to ensure they're growing up in the faith. Again, to ensure they're growing up in the faith. That was always the purpose of the school. Obviously, one of the great saints we think of, not only just in general as an American saint, but specifically with regard to Catholic education, was St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. In 1810, at St. Joseph's Parish in Emmitsburg, Maryland, she founds the first free parochial school, no tuition, for both boys and girls, taught by religious sisters. They started with 20 pupils. I think that's also important to note, right? We're gonna get in just a few minutes to 1965, again, when we're at 5.5 million. And Elizabeth Ann Seton started her first school with 20 kids. It doesn't have to be a big endeavor, right? And that's what we'll see over time. Again, facilities. A lot of times we think of facilities are such a... Where do we find the right facilities? St. Elizabeth Ann Seton started in a 2-story log house. That was it, with 20 kids. It was free instruction, free textbooks, and a free meal. So this is where you're going to start hearing from the bishops. In 1829, they have their first provincial council in Baltimore. And at that time they said, since it is evident that very many of the young, the children of Catholic parents, especially the poor, have been exposed and are still exposed in many places of this province to great danger of the loss of faith or the corruption of morals. Again, religion and morality. On account of the lack of such teachers as could safely be entrusted with so great an office, we judge it absolutely necessary that schools should be established in which the young may be taught the principles of faith and morality while being instructed in letters, in liberal arts. See what goes first and what goes second. The other thing I want to note, it says there's a danger of them losing the faith or having their morals corrupted on account of the lack of such teachers as could safely be entrusted with so great an office. What did the bishops mean in 1829? At that time, what they meant by that, what they would have taken for granted, is that the only way to execute the mission of Catholic education, the only way to hand on the faith, would be through a teacher who were themselves a good, strong Catholic role model. Okay? And there was a shortage of that. That's what the bishops are talking about. It wasn't a shortage of instructors. It wasn't a shortage of people who could teach the liberal arts. It was a shortage of good Catholics who could teach. Because in their mind, that was the only way you could pass on the faith, which was the mission of Catholic education. In 1838, John Hughes is named the Archbishop of New York. He becomes one of the prominent promoters nationally of Catholic schools in the United States. And his motto was, the school before the church. In his mind, as they were establishing new parishes and new communities, as the population grew, his opinion was that you build the school first and the church second. Again, it seemed it somewhat is pragmatic, but it also, if you think about from a macro perspective, from the vision of Catholic education, if it's to pass on the faith, then the school is more important than the church. Because if you don't have the school, if you're not passing on the faith, the church is going to end up empty eventually. Okay? So by 1865, in just under 30 years, 75% of his parishes in the city of New York had schools, and they were already serving 16,000 students. At around the same time, by the 1850s, remember we said at about the early 1700s, the colonies start to establish public schools. By the 1850s, they are a genuine part of American society. They're becoming an expected part of the American experience. This is what really forces the hand of the Catholics, of the bishops and pastors, because they felt that the public schools were both, in their words, both heretical and infidel. Okay? There was a dominant Protestant culture within the public schools, and it was a very anti-Catholic culture, obviously. At the same time, however, the Catholic hierarchy is really growing in confidence. Okay? They're feeling like they can push back because now they are the largest Christian denomination in the United States, okay, because of all the immigration. So we've got numbers. We don't necessarily have wealth or political influence, but we've got numbers, and that gave the bishops some confidence. So as those public schools begin to grow and become just expected, the bishops start to push back. So in the first plenary council of Baltimore, and this is the time all of the bishops of the United States get together in Baltimore in 1852, they say, we exhort the bishops, and in view of the very grave evils which usually result from the defective education of youth, we beseech them through the bowels of the mercy of God to see that schools be established in connection with all the churches of their diocese. And if it be necessary and circumstances permit, to provide from the revenues of the church to which the school is attached for the support of competent teachers. Again, what did they mean by competent teachers? Faithful Catholics who could also teach. What did they see? What did they define parochial schools as? At the time, a theological commission, at the time of the First Plenary Council of Baltimore, defined it this way, that parochial schools are institutions in which none but Catholic children are admitted, and which are conducted by teachers having the approbation of the pastor, exercising their office under his direction and superintendence, and making the catechism the frequent subject of their instruction to those under their charge. Okay, let's break that down. That none but Catholic children are admitted. That might strike as kind of exclusive. But again, think about how they understood the mission of Catholic education. If it is to pass along the faith, if it's to pass along the culture, it's a pragmatic matter that it would only be Catholic students. It would be assumed, and this is how the bishops thought, that Jewish communities would have their own Jewish schools to pass on Jewish culture. Protestants would have their own Protestant schools to pass on Protestant culture. So it wasn't about being exclusive, but it was about what is the mission of Catholic education, and if you understood that, then this comment is a pragmatic matter. It's not an exclusive matter. Secondly, which are conducted by teachers having the approbation of the pastor. Again, that's a fancy way of saying the pastor says, this is somebody who I can trust to pass on the Catholic faith, because that's the pastor's job. And then exercising their office under his direction and superintendence, the pastors. So these pastors were very involved in both the founding and the running of these schools. The pastor was the head of the school, unquestionably. In 1855, at the First Provincial Council of Cincinnati, the bishops admonished pastors of souls again and again to strive by all means in their power to prevent boys and girls entrusted to them from frequenting those schools which they cannot attend without grave danger to their faith and morals. And at the same time, we exhort parents to aid and sustain parochial and other schools which are under Catholic direction. So now you start hearing not only exhortations to the pastors, but the bishops start talking to the parents too. Because with the rise and sort of normal expectedness of the public schools, a lot of Catholic parents are just going through the motions, and there's a local public school, and great, and it's free. And so the bishops start talking to parents as well as pastors. In 1858, the Second Provincial Council of Cincinnati says, it is the judgment of the fathers that all pastors of souls are bound under pain of mortal sin to provide a Catholic school in every parish or congregation subject to them where this can be done. Under pain of mortal sin. So again, I'm going through these statements from the bishops to understand, how did we get to that high point in 65? The bishops were pushing it hard because they saw it as a grave matter of handing on the faith. And that if they didn't do this, if they didn't get this done, these children were in grave danger of losing their faith and being corrupted, morally speaking. In 1866, at the Second Plenary Council of Baltimore, the bishops say the best, nay, the only remedy that remains in order to meet these very grave evils and inconveniences seems to lie in this, that in every diocese, schools, each close to the church, should be erected, in which the Catholic youth may be instructed in letters and the noble arts, as well as in religion and sound morals. So again and again. By 1875, the issue with the public schools in the United States has gotten so grave with the Catholics. It was so anti-Catholic, and the bishops were so concerned about the loss of faith that was taking place in those public schools that the Vatican actually got involved. And so in consultation with the Vatican, this instruction to the bishops of the United States concerning public schools, specifically directed at how are you as bishops and as pastors to handle the situation of public schools in America. And they said, all are agreed that there is nothing so needful to this end as the establishment of Catholic schools in every place, and schools no whit inferior to the public ones. And this is interesting. They said, every effort then must be directed towards starting Catholic schools where they are not, so starting new Catholic schools where they need to be, and where they are, towards enlarging them and providing them with better accommodations and equipment until they have nothing to suffer as regards teachers or furniture, by comparison with the public schools. So not only start them where they're not, but grow them to such a point that they are as resourced as the public schools. And now think about that statement. These bishops are talking largely to poor immigrant communities. And they're saying, support these schools to such a degree that there's no competition with the public schools in terms of resources, but the public schools are being funded through tax dollars. And they're saying, poor immigrants, get this done. Pastors, get this done. Bishops, get this done. And they did. They also, like I said, are talking to the parents. It says, parents who neglect to give this necessary Christian training and instruction to their children, or who permit them to go to schools in which the ruin of their souls is inevitable. That's strong language. They thought that sending your child to public school at the time, it would be inevitable that their soul would be ruined. Or finally, who send them to the public school without sufficient cause and without taking the necessary precautions to render the danger of perversion remote, and do so while there was a good and well-equipped Catholic school in the place, where the parents have the means to send them elsewhere to be educated, that such parents, if obstinate, cannot be absolved, cannot be forgiven. That would be evident from the moral teaching of the church. Again, a lot of words. I like classical education. We like primary sources. That's why I'm giving you the direct quotes. But in short, in a more succinct way, they're saying, if you've got parents, if you've got any chance of getting your kid to a Catholic school and you don't, there's no forgiveness for that. That's a really strong statement. By 1884, we have the strongest statement that we're going to get from the Catholic bishops. It's the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, and they mandate, for the first time really, they use the word must. Every parish must have a parochial school, and every Catholic parent must send their children to a Catholic school unless excused for grave reasons. Okay? The other things that the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore established: mandatory Catholic schools, a parish school in every parish, immediate construction of schools where they don't exist already, teachers trained in both doctrine and pedagogy, pastors to place Catholic education as their top priority. That all pastors in the entire United States, that their top priority be Catholic schools. And that Catholic parents are to avoid public schools except when physically or financially impossible. Not inconvenient, impossible. The Third Plenary Council of Baltimore is also where we got the Baltimore Catechism that we know today. Again, speaking directly to parents. Therefore, we not only exhort Catholic parents with paternal love, but we also command them with all the authority in our power to procure for their beloved offspring given to them by God, reborn in Christ in baptism and destined for heaven, a truly Christian and Catholic education, and to defend and safeguard them from the dangers of an education merely secular during the entire period of childhood and youth, and therefore to send them to parochial schools or others truly Catholic. Last big quote, I think. In 1912, the Catholic Encyclopedia defines schools, well, in the entry for schools in the 1912 Catholic Encyclopedia, there's a point on pastors. This is under schools. It said, the pastor bears the full responsibility of providing for the material and moral support of the school, which is no small burden. He must see to it that teachers are faithful to their vocation and competent in their work. The priest's greatest aid to the school comes from his active interest in it and his encouragement of everything relating to its progress. In a general way, he may be said to occupy the place of principal, and his presence and zeal contribute more to the success of the school than the efforts of any other single person. Again, the pastor was seen as the head of the school. There was no question about that. So we've arrived at 1965, the high water mark. By this time, we've got over 13,000 schools in the United States with 5.5 million students, which was 10% of all the students in the United States were in Catholic schools. That's incredible. 1 in 5 Catholic children went to a Catholic school. There were 176,000 religious sisters teaching in Catholic schools. And they were funded by parishes with little to no public support. And they were doing all this and seen as the gold standard of education in most cases. They were doing it at a quarter of the cost of public schools, as are many Catholic schools today. And at this point, we, the Catholic Church of the United States, had created the largest single private school network ever created. And that was the high water mark. So I want to bring you back to that opening quote and just focus your attention to that sentence that I repeated twice the first time, that during 2 centuries, the growth of Catholic schools was due largely to the vision and zeal of individual pastors. That to me is the big takeaway when you study how did we get to where we got in 1965. It was the vision and zeal of individual pastors, and who were being encouraged strongly, as you've seen by now, by the bishops. But that's how we got it done. It wasn't a big system-wide the bishop of the Archdiocese of fill in the blank said, okay, we're 30 schools and we're going to do it this way. And it was this pastor and this pastor and this pastor and this pastor and this pastor till we got to 5.5 million and 13,000 schools. And this is the last quote I want to leave you with. This is out of a book called The Parish School by Tim Walsh. It's a history of the parish school in the United States. He says, yet the most important theme, one that pervades the history of Catholic education from its earliest days, and he means in America, is sacrifice. For more than 2 centuries, Catholics from many nations and a wide range of professions were willing to risk their personal safety for the greater glory of God. To be sure, some of these Catholics were motivated by the hope of personal gain, yet one cannot dispute that most colonial Catholics, missionaries and colonists alike, were willing to sacrifice their well-being for the sake of education. They all knew that the future of the church in the New World was tied to educating the next generation in the ways of the faith. It was a goal worthy of great personal sacrifice. Because of that vision, because they knew that the future of the church in the New World was tied to education, that's how we got to 1965, 13,000 schools, 5.5 million students, because we believed that statement. The bishops believed it. If pastors didn't already believe it, the bishops made them believe it, as you've seen. And over that time, I mean, again, 65 is just the high water mark. But you think of the millions of American citizens, newly arrived to America in most instances, formed in both religion and morals, as our founding fathers intended. Not only intended, but as they said, would be necessary for the future of the Republic. There is no entity in the history of the United States of America that provided that, which they said would be necessary, to a greater degree than the Catholic school system in the United States. No entity, not even close. Not even close. So that is why the impact of Catholic education in these 250 years has been so great, and that is why it is truly an unparalleled marvel in human history. Thank you.
A couple of questions and answers, maybe. I want to kick it off just so I understand that list of cool. They all knew the future of the church in the New World was tied to educating the next generation in the ways of the faith. Are you trying to tell me that the supposition is not that the purpose of Catholic education is to be dominant on the football field? Some way, I think we've lost our moral compass here a little bit, maybe.
I have no idea.
I don't know. So,
Personal experience with that.
you're talking about high water mark 1965. Now again, let's use our math skills. 1776, 200 years would be what? 1976. So this is 10 years before the bicentennial. So in less than 200 years, we go from 1% Catholic population to education dominance, which then elevated the entire standard of living for not only the United States, but through the war, the Depression of the war, the post-war Cold War conflict, all of the rising tides of affluence and economic, all benefits from well-formed Catholic leaders who are doing their part. Something's happened during the next 60 years, and that's a talk for another time. But it's important to understand, why do we study history? Because it shows us that it's not only can be done, but it was done, and when we need a course correction, must be done, relevant to the time we live in. So if it means founding new schools, like the Camino school, or new systems like the Pax Christi system, which our Diocese of Orange has done something radical. It assessed our situation and said, we need to do something different. So they created a system inside the system in order to try and reform and revitalize the system. But also, one of our Catholic high school presidents came to us at the retreat center and pitched an idea for a Catholic trade school. And for you guys that are wearing the hoodies and that are getting up at 5:30 in the morning and are in the chapel at 6 a.m. and going to daily mass and then evening prayer after dinner and then nightly rosary before we go to bed at 10 p.m. living the structured life. Much of it's kind of rooted in the rhythm of what we've seen here articulated in the preceding centuries. Does anybody know who the inspiration for that school was for Dan and I? He's standing at the podium. So how about a nice round of appreciation? All right, what kind of questions do you have for Mr. Weir, the teacher?
No, go for it.
Chris, how does the Catholic university system fit into this story?
Yeah, great question. It's part of the uniqueness, obviously. So because we had that system, again, we're kind of the only entity who has, K through 16. Well, I mean, K through 20, really, when you think about grad school and all that, in somewhat of a system. So the growth of the universities and colleges is a little different. It's not as systematic because it tended to be tied to, you usually don't have it as a function of dioceses and under the provision of bishops. They obviously have authority over in terms of religious, but a lot of them pop up through religious orders, things of that nature. So the branches of the tree are a little different, but obviously the fact that we were pumping out, the graduates that we were at the K through 12 level, I think allowed for a lot of that growth that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to see what your assessment would be for the fact that, in the early years, pre-65 to the colonial period, most Catholic parochial schools were based in immigrant neighborhoods. In other words, if you had a parochial school, it was an Irish school with Irish students, Italian students, German, and they didn't mix. Deliberately, they didn't mix.
Correct.
And of course, in those schools, for example, except for like in a place like New Orleans, where you did have a Creole population, African Americans were de facto excluded, not sure, but de facto excluded, or Mexican students. What were the positives of having ethnic Catholic schools, and what do you think the negatives of those were?
Yeah, great question. First of all, before I lose the thought, I think I would be careful to use the word excluded, and here's why. Because a lot of those communities, these ethnic communities, they popped up because it was a function of the church. Well, the school was a function of the church. As you have these immigrants come in, they want to hold on, and I think this is the unique part of it being Catholic, right? We're Americans, but we're such an immigrant church here in the United States. We also bring many interesting elements from our ethnic cultures, back at our home countries, that we wanted to preserve. And remember that we weren't just preserving this secular ethnic culture. It was part of our Catholic identity, right? So there were very unique things about what it meant to be an Italian Catholic versus an Irish Catholic versus a Polish Catholic. And I think those were the things that were most tightly held on to. And so that's the good. Because we're a universal church, because we're a Catholic church, we wanted to hold on to all that stuff, and we did. Any negative, I think, is just what would naturally come about when you have, competing communities that feel like they have an identity that they want to protect. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some human, sinfulness involved, but I think for the most part, it was again, kind of the way I described the way the bishops when they said only Catholic students would be enrolled in these schools. It wasn't about exclusivity; it just wouldn't make sense. Why would a Polish kid come to the Irish school? I mean, it's just. I don't think it was about exclusion as much as it would be. Why would the Polish kid want to go? I mean, he would want to hold on to his Polish. I think it was more about that, and so I think it was a positive thing in that regard.
Back in like the 1800s, especially, what was the typical duration of education? Did people did they go through high school until they were 18?
Great question. I'm not super sure. I think the little I do know about that is I think they left. So there was K through 12 opportunity. I think kids were working a lot younger than they do today, right? So I think some would peel out after 6th, 7th, 8th grade and be working. So I think high school. I don't think it was a given.
So with the exhortation that every Catholic parent must send their children to a Catholic school, is there like an age, like an expiration for that?
Yeah, good point. I think it's primarily directed at the elementary schools. Yeah. Because remember, too, the secondary schools, the parish schools were, I mean, I've known of very few exceptions to this. A parish school would typically be K through 8. And I think at the time it was because right around then you'd either be working or continuing school. And I think the first population was larger than the second. Father.
So two things. Number one, what is the state of the total attendance of students in Catholic
Currently?
schools? What 5.5 million was the
I
high
think we're
mark
at
in
1.2,
65?
if I remember.
1.2?
Something like that, yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Order. Oh, my gosh. And secondly, so you had all these Protestants. I mean, the Lutherans were all big about education. They still are. Interestingly enough, they're the only denomination I know that takes very seriously the dictum that each parish should have its own school.
Is that right?
So that's okay. Well,
Yeah.
you know, Martin Luther, he liked to drink a lot of beer, whatever. Anyhow, but in terms of what happens with the public schools as they're filtered through John Dewey and the terrible secularization and what we have now in our public schools 100 years later, versus the fact that we now, and I guess my question is this, Chris, is that in terms of the trajectory of classical, of not just, God willing, all Catholic schools will be classical. That's our prayer. Is the trajectory is no longer...
I would say, God willing, all Catholic schools will be Catholic.
Catholic, yeah.
That's all you have to
What a concept. Is that cultural Catholicism, for the most part, certainly in our country, and I think throughout Europe, is pretty much said and done, which makes the opportunity for us then to say, okay, well, as Catholics, we are going to be self-consciously intentional, self-consciously evangelical. It's kind of like a new evangelism. So, and that has to be reflected in the life of the schools as well, right? So that it's post immigrant, but we sure don't want to do anything that has happened in modern public education.
Sure, I mean, that,
So how do we
again,
distinguish ourselves and how do we move forward, I guess, is let me
no, well, now you're getting into the second talk, but, or maybe third. It's the rise, the fall, and what do we do now, right? No, I would say, I lost my train of thought. But you're saying, what do we do moving forward?
There's an evangelistic quality to...
Oh, I know what I was going to say. You know, when we read those quotes about how grave the bishops saw the dangers of the public education system back then, I mean, can you imagine what they'd think of you know, a lesson plan, you know, created around TikTok or something, like, and the content therein? So yeah, I would. It'd be fun if I make it to heaven to have that chat with those bishops about, you know, what they thought of current public education. But anyway, as far as what we do moving forward, it's, again, I've said this a lot when I speak, so you may have heard me say this before, but one of the biggest light bulb moments for me in a career in Catholic education was when I realized Catholic education is about passing on culture, not about running schools. And I think if you understand that fundamental difference, everything changes. And I think that the understanding of that fundamental difference, I think, is the answer to everything. Because if you're really trying to pass on culture, you're going to do everything differently. You're going to see everything differently. You're going to admit students and families differently. You're going to structure your curriculum differently. You'll do everything differently. And I think that's what I was trying to emphasize. As we saw all those quotes, the way the bishops understood, the way any Catholic at the time would understand, the purpose of the Catholic school was to protect the moral development of the child and to pass on the faith. That's why they existed. That's it. It's not to run schools. It's not to keep enrollment high. St. Elizabeth Ann Seton started with 20 kids. You know, if our schools are getting smaller but more Catholic, then that's good. It's actually better. Oh. Yes, sir.
So you started like a whole new school with the Camino schools. Why not? Because there is a great structure of the schools that once hold 5 million students. why not revive what we already have? Like, why is it? Like, is it like what we already have is just like it's over and we just have to like start fresh? Or
I mean, why don't we take, I don't know, a school that at one point had 900 boys, which was the dominant sports program that had incredible impact, which then became 500 morally wimpy people, hire someone to write a curriculum reformation program to once again climb those scales of dominance. Why don't we do that? Yeah, why don't we do that?
Let me answer the question slightly differently. It's a great question. First, I'll just say what you're talking about is happening widely all over the United States. Thanks be to God. So the way I fell into all this is I was working at a Catholic school and we were trying to work on some projects, and I just I hadn't really read anything about like church documents on Catholic education or the history of Catholic, so I started to, and I went, wait a minute. I always thought school was school, and a Catholic school was different from a public school in sort of the trappings around it. You know, we wore uniforms, we went to Mass, we talked about God, you know. But as I studied the history of Catholic education, the philosophy of Catholic education, I went, wait a minute, this is fundamentally different than anything I've ever experienced myself. So all that is to say, there is a renewal taking place within Catholic education where Catholic educators all over the country and world really are realizing that, I think slowly over time, like the frog boiling in water, right? And again, with all good intentions, I think we tried to keep up with the Joneses, right? The public schools were doing that, so we said, oh, we should do that. And all of a sudden, you have Catholic schools that are exactly like a public school. Textbooks are the same, curriculum's the same, pedagogy is the same, everything's the same, except those trappings that I talked about. So you've got a growing body of educators all over the world realizing that and reclaiming an authentically Catholic approach to education, which is great. In the particular case of Camino School, there are some elements like the founders wanted a school that was founded on some of the principles of the spirituality of St. Josemaria Escriva, right? And there are other schools in the country, all over the country, that are like that. Another uniqueness is we're going to end up single sex in the upper grades. That just doesn't exist right now. So it's kind of a unique model of education that exists elsewhere that our founders wanted to have an option of here in Orange County. It wasn't because they didn't want to do it in parishes or something. It was for a unique reason. But the parish thing is happening. My previous post and where my kids go to school is Holy Innocents in Long Beach. That's exactly what you're talking about. It was a Catholic school that had dwindled in enrollment. It was down to like 140 students. Things weren't going well. We called it classical. It went authentically Catholic in all things, curriculum, pedagogy, everything. And now it's got over 300 students and it's thriving. Right, so that can be done, and that's being done far more often than independent schools like Camino.
What good part of town is that school located?
Our pastor, Father Peter Irving, calls it the classical barrio. So,
But the liturgy there also
yes,
goes together.
and to that point, what I was going to say is one of the reasons why. Like, I would love to dedicate my career to just reviving parishes, but what's the critical element that we saw? How did we build the Catholic school system in America? Pastors. So you can't just pull that out of thin air, okay? And the pastors that want to do that, unfortunately, sometimes can be hard to find. I think that number is growing. I think with the young priests that are coming up, they understand that a little better. But that's the critical part. So parents that want a great parish school, educators that want to work at a great parish school, the one factor they can't control is that pastor, that if you really want it to thrive, the pastor's got to be the sole driver of everything. That's what happened at Holy Innocents.
And Holy Innocents is number one in the Archdiocese in Catholic education on the standardized test. Number one.
Wow.
Number 3 in the country.
Number 3 in the country. And so number 2 is our associate pastor's school that he started at St. Therese.
Who might that be?
Yep.
Father Philip.
Yep.
So,
And Father Philip is the reason that Holy Innocents is what it is today.
Yes.
He said you should go talk to Father Peter Irving.
I think when you're revitalizing the schools, you're going to have a hard time finding the educators and teachers. And then you're going to have a hard time finding the teachers who, they have the problem also. have a hard time finding teachers who are really that devout and pass that along.
They cleaned up the school at St. Therese.
Yeah.
And it was, they dropped out.
Yeah. So you don't have the sisters anymore that use it. That's true.
That's an important thing, is that we don't have the sisters anymore. What's happened to religious orders in terms of those numbers is nowhere near the collapse that you've seen in terms of enrollment of people in Catholic schools. The number of sisters is non-existent. They're going through their own renewal now. The great news about the Catholic Church is the principle of subsidiarity. That if something's not working at the macro, that's okay. At the micro, we are empowered. In fact, we are instructed to do something about it. So if you got a school that's not thriving in the parish, there are alternatives, including looking in the mirror and saying, let's use Catholic homeschooling. And the explosion in the number of people, particularly post-COVID, that have embraced the responsibility for forming their own children, because guess what? Parents are the primary and first educator of the child. And if the bishops are going to be held accountable for their lack of leadership in terms of forming Catholics, what's it going to be for us parents? And that's really the question, not complain about the bishops or the pastors or the sisters or all this other stuff. It's to look at our own hearts and say, what am I doing as a husband, father, parent, mom, sibling, uncle, grandparent, to make sure that those children are being formed in the faith? That's all working together. Devil.
Yeah, so you mentioned like 5 times like the schools were only for Catholic students because of the reasons we want to take on to the next generation like that. But we also want to evangelize to like people at outside, right? I assume you're going to say something like, oh yeah, we can do this instead of that. I don't understand why it has to be either or, because like why can't it be like just like we win and they lose, like they don't get something
I'm sorry, I didn't mean it in a we win, they lose sense. I was mainly commenting on that quote, because the bishop said only Catholic students. I wanted to contextualize that so that people didn't interpret it in an exclusive way and help people understand what the bishops would have meant by that. As far as the question for today, again, because it's not about being exclusive, it was more of a pragmatic thought. I don't think Catholic schools need to exclude non-Catholics, and there's many cases. J. Sarah is a perfect example. Obviously, J. Sarah is not 100% Catholic, nowhere near it. I don't know if they're 50% Catholic. They brought in 30 kids, non-Catholic kids, to the church the last 2 years. Okay, so there's a place for that, absolutely. I think the question is, what's the right balance to ensuring that we have a culture that can be imbibed by those Catholic students whose parents are sending them there to pass on the faith? At what point does having non-Catholics around water it down enough that we're not doing a good enough job passing on the faith, if that makes sense, right? So,
That's school modern day.
jeez, he's not holding anything back.
From your school being at a Presbyterian church that you guys were renting to St. Nicholas, so there's a diocesan interface now with it. It's a good comment if you would.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's once we were officially approved as a Catholic school within the Diocese of Orange by Bishop Van, that opened up the possibility of us talking to Catholic churches about space, and it worked out at St. Nick's. I think obviously the Holy Spirit's involved, because as Mark kind of joked, it's a great merger because it's this retirement community parish, which, by the way, I've never seen a more active parish in my entire life anywhere. Because they got nothing but time on their hands. So,
Hear that, Bill? That's where you need to go for your volunteers.
Yeah.
All right, Chris Weir.
Thanks, Mark.